We call it Bible Story Sunday because one Sunday a year the children all study the same story from the Bible and I get to preach on it. And it's usually a story I wouldn't have ever preached on if it didn't show up on Bible Story Sunday. But it's a good one. Let me tell you a story. It's amazing, is it not, the place that stories have in our lives. If there's any ritual left in this business of parenting or even grandparenting, it has to be the bedtime story. Little Red Riding Hood, Three Little Pigs, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Charlotte's Web, Peter Rabbit, Green Eggs and Ham, The Little Engine That Could, Ferdinand the Bull. Then come along Sleeping Beauty, Black Beauty, Alice in Wonderland, Huck Finn, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. And it's not just the children either, is it? Think of the enormous number of stories that swim through our heads as we watch television, read the Da Vinci Code, take off to the cinema to see what else, The Passion. Cartoons are stories, and even commercials. If you look carefully at them, most all of them have a plot with some suspense and some resolution of the problem. Your teeth are not white, but at the end they are, right? And stories are present to our lives in more subtle and fragmentary ways. Pay attention at the next party you attend to what everybody is chattering about. Isn't it overwhelmingly stories we tell to one another? Did you hear what happened to Helen? You can't imagine what happened to me driving home the other day. Stories. Are they uniquely human? I assume so. Although it is said that a computer specialist was dogged by the question as to whether computers would ever think like we humans. So one day he developed a supercomputer and put the question to it. Do you compute that you will ever think like a human? The computer, normally instantaneous, went silent for a while, and then words flashed on the screen. That reminds me of a story. So why stories? Is it a mere matter of entertainment, diversion, vicarious adventure? These, of course. But more than that, stories involve invasive, memorable interpretations of reality that make some sense of the off-crazy course of our days here. You live in a story for a while, and if it stays with you, haunts your dreams, pops up in some vagrant reverie, it may, in fact, shape a little the way in which you think and live. Memorable they are, stories we remember, not so much statistics, formula, principles, laws, but stories. Moses parting the waters, David and Goliath, Jesus and his crucifixion, Lincoln at Gettysburg, the battle for Britain, Lucky Lindy, the walk on the moon, 9/11. And you never know what one is coming next. But they're above all, in a way, interpretations of reality. Stories tell us about the meaning of life and how we might possibly act. If the stories we buy into are realistic and hopeful, we thrive and are happy. If the stories that we allowed to invade our psyches are crude or cynical, we can be easily overtaken by these and find life less worth living. I suspect a lot of the depression abroad in the land is due to the embrace of bad stories. Life no longer means anything, is no longer going anywhere. So whoever tells the stories controls literally the health and well-being of the people. So Jesus tells stories, stories that draw us in, that call upon us to identify with one or another of the characters, call upon us to make critical decisions about who we are and how we shall live. And it's interesting, he talks quite often about the lost. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. The Pharisees and the scribes stood afar, grumbling, and said, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this story. Which of you, having 100 sheep, losing one of them, does not leave the 99 and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I've found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So our story for this Sunday is one of three that he tells in succession about the lost. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. We'll stick with the sheep this morning. But it does suggest, does it not, that it is possible to lose our way in life if we're not careful. Thank God my wife now has a car with a compass. Okay. But seriously, losing our way in life suggests something other than deliberate intention. No one sets out to get lost. It just sort of happens. As the old prophet put it, we like sheep have gone astray. And this, says Jesus, is part of the human predicament, all of ours. Very few of us, thank God, set out to do deliberate mischief. Very few are determined to be disagreeable, devilish, destructive. It's just sort of that we get caught up with lesser things, our own desires, and we lose touch with our moorings and wander off, as it were. And this is the way Jesus characterizes sin and sinners most of the time. They miss the mark somehow in life, like one little sheep. Picture's a familiar one. Throughout the biblical period, tending flocks, along with some subsistence agriculture, was the whole basis of their economy, their survival. And you can see remnants of this era still in the Bedouins who wander the wilderness east of Jerusalem. Hard, dangerous life in many ways, pasture scarce, narrow plateau only a few miles wide, then plunges on all sides to wild cliffs and the devastation of the desert. In Jesus' day, most of the flocks were communal, belonging to the whole village, which was nothing but a big extended family, and the shepherd was held personally responsible for the sheep. If one sheep was lost, the shepherd had to at least bring home the fleece to show how it died. Every animal counted. Fortunately, sheep did not often stray. They're famous, for sticking together. We sometimes recoil at reference to God's people as a bunch of sheep. But one thing you can say about sheep, they can be led. Cattle, hogs, you got to get behind them and drive them. So it was probably a young one, and he had to be found, because when a young sheep found himself alone, lost his bearings, he would lay down and not move until he died. So the story of the shepherd picking him up, finding him, throwing him over his shoulders is one that everybody would resonate with, as well as the picture of the whole village greeting his return with great celebration and great joy. And this does happen to human beings as well from time to time. They do get lost, and they need to be found. I once was lost, but now am found. The words of the familiar hymn by John Newton that we just sang. They're biographical. They describe the way he came to view his life. Born an only child, his mother died when he was 7. She was a very religious woman and had spent time with him talking about the faith, but he fell then under the distant care of his rather cold sea captain father, and from 11 to 17 he endured 5 rugged sea voyages. In between, he was with a stepmother who pretty much let him do as he pleased, run free. 1742, Captain Newton arranged for his son to go to Jamaica with a Liverpool ship owner who had an intense interest in the slave trade and in sugar. But John met and fell in love with a Mary Catlett shortly before he was supposed to sail, and he missed the ship. So his father determined that he was going to teach him a lesson. He was going to teach him some discipline as a common sailor, which is not quite what John learned. Rather, he learned to be a foul-mouthed, hard-drinking, brothel-visiting seaman like the rest of his peers. In 1744, he fell prey to a naval press gang. After 5 years' sail to the East Indies, he jumped ship only to be arrested by a party of Marines who stripped and flogged him and returned him to duty. During the next 2 years, Newton describes the illness and starvation and exposure and ridicule from his mates that he suffered. Then on March 21st, 1748, during a violent storm, tied to the ship to prevent being washed overboard, pumping and bailing all night long, he became convinced that he was going to die. And he at last clung to words that he learned from his mother as a child about the grace of God, and breathed his first weak prayer in years. As he remembered it years later, the hour I first believed. I once was lost, but now I'm found. He had repented, that is to say, he turned his life around. John Newton, the lost sheep who had been found by God, went on to become a priest of the Church of England and was very instrumental in the elimination of the slave trade in which he'd labored. And it is a beautiful story, and we sing it better than we do most hymns, by the way. But in a sense, we don't identify with that kind of story, not most of us. We don't really see ourselves in that lost sheep, do we? And neither did those to whom Jesus tells the story, the Pharisees and the scribes. Now we have spent a little time with them because they've gotten a bad rap. Pharisee, hypocrite. Not really, not most of them. Actually, Jesus was probably closer to this group than any of the other Jewish parties of that day. They made very good neighbors. The Pharisees were the precursors of the rabbinic Judaism that followed the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the ancestors, if you will, of the Orthodox Jews of our time. And their concern, the question as to why God had abandoned his people, his chosen people. Ever since exile in Babylon in 586 BC, you remember Daniel and the lions. The Israelis had suffered brutally under one empire after another, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, now Rome. You remember Tevye and Fiddler saying to God, "Oh God, if this is what it means to be the chosen people, choose somebody else for a while." Their conclusion, though, Israel had abandoned strict adherence to the written and oral traditions of Moses. Observance of the Sabbath, the dietary laws, the ritual washings and sacrifices, and above all, avoidance of contact with all violators, among whom the tax collectors were the worst example. Because of those people, they believed, the sinners, God had withheld his presence. Because of them, Messiah has not come. They never numbered more than about 6,000. But they set themselves up as guardians of the law of Moses and therefore saviors of the nation. They had a saying, we know it, if all Israel will keep the law of Moses perfectly for one day, Messiah will come. For some of these Pharisees then, those who'd lost their way, as it were, those who did not adhere strictly to the religious law, were enemies of the people. Were undermining the possibility of rescue by God. But of course, the problem with their passion was that it made it impossible for them to see what they had in common with those lost. Secure in their religious convictions and codes and ceremonies, they could not understand that the line between good and evil was not a line between them and the sinners. As Solzhenitsyn put it, he discovered it in the Gulag. The line between good and evil runs right through every human heart. The danger in considering oneself secure before God because of religious position and performance, the danger is that one becomes blind to the frailties and failures that are still one's own. And therefore one lives excluding others. One is already lost in the sense that one has not faced and learned one's own heart. So we need to read Jesus' words as sheer sarcasm. 99 righteous who need no repentance. The Pharisees are the 99. And the 99 don't know that they too, in one way or another, at times, are also lost, have wandered astray. I know in my own experience, where I do go wrong, it's more like that. It's not that I wake up in the morning thinking of something devilish I want to do. It's just that somewhere in the course of the day, I wander a bit from where I set out to be. I like something Fred Buechner has written here. What I mean is, if we come to church right, we come to it more fully ourselves, we come with more of our humanness showing than we're apt to come to most places with. We come like Moses with muck on our shoes, footsore and travel-stained, with the dust of our lives upon us. our failures, our deceits, our hypocrisies. Because if, unlike Moses, we've never taken anybody's life, we have again and again withheld from others, including often those nearest to us, the love that might make their lives worth living, not to mention our own. Like Moses, we come here as we are. Like him, we come as strangers and exiles in our way, because it is wherever it is that we truly belong, whatever it is that is truly home for us, we know in our hearts that we've somehow lost or have gotten lost from. Something is missing from our lives that we cannot even name often. We come here to find what we've lost. We come to acknowledge that in terms of the best that we could be, we are lost. And that's precisely what these otherwise admirable and morally serious Pharisees could not see about themselves. So they could not understand why Jesus spent time with those who knew that they were lost. And so they were unavailable to his company and compassion for their needs. But the most startling thing about the story is the fact that Jesus is trying to recruit them to be shepherds. It's a little like trying to recruit all of you to work for the sanitary district in Chicago. Startling because of the shock of the idea. In the Old Testament, God is described as Israel's shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Or as one little girl recited it, the Lord is my shepherd, that's all I want. By contrast, God is never called a shepherd in the New Testament. And the image is limited to Jesus' parables, because by the first century, the shepherds had acquired a bad reputation as being shiftless, dirty. The rabbis listed them among the despised, along with camel drivers, sailors, gamblers, tax collectors. Yet Jesus responds to criticism over his acceptance of tax collectors and sinners by telling a story that casts God in the role of a shepherd, no less, who reaches out, who seeks the lost. And the invitation to the Pharisees, and I think therefore to you and me, is implicit. Like a shepherd God, we are to seek one another in our lostness, one by one. When Mother Teresa asked how she did all she did, she replied, just one by one. Buechner also tells of a time when he was shepherded in his lostness. I remember a especially dark time of my life. One of my children was sick, and in my anxiety for her, I was in my own way as sick as she was. Then one day the phone rang, and it was a friend I didn't know very well, although he became a great friend over a lifetime. A man from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is about 800 miles or so from where I live in Vermont. I assumed he was calling from home and asked him how things were doing down there, only to hear him say that no, he wasn't in Charlotte. He was at an inn about 20 minutes away. He'd known I was having troubles, he said, and thought maybe it'd be handy to have an extra friend around just for a day or two. The reason he didn't tell me in advance that he was coming must have been that he knew I would tell him for heaven's sake not to do anything so crazy. So for heaven's sake, he did something crazier, which was to come those 800 miles without telling me he was coming, so that for all he knew, I might not even be there. But as luck had it, I was there, and for a day or two, he was there with me. He was there for me. I don't think anything we found to say to each other amounted to very much or had anything particularly to do with religion. I don't remember even spending much time talking about my troubles with him. We just took a couple of walks, had a meal or two together, smoked our pipes, drove around to see some of the countryside, and that was about it. But I've never forgotten how he came all that distance just for me. I also believe that although, as far as I can remember, we never so much as mentioned the name of Christ, Christ was as much in the air those days that we breathed as the smoke of our pipes was in the air or the dappled light of the woods that we walked through. And I do believe that for a little time, both of us touched the hem of Christ's garment, where both of us, for a little while anyway, healed. When I read that story, I could not help but see the figure of a shepherd Jesus seeking out one of his sheep, lost and alone, to bring him home to joy.